and welcome to the latest episode of the Reach Prevention of Targeted Violence podcast. Join us today as we explore various facets of violence prevention through insightful conversations with community partners and experts. I'm Andy Martinez, your host and a team member of the Reach Project. I am excited to be here with you. The topic we want to explore today is Hispanic youth radicalization to violence extremism. The radicalization of Hispanic youth to violence extremism can have far-reaching consequences, including the perpetration of violence and fracturing of community trust. Preventing Hispanic youth radicalization requires understanding the factors driving vulnerability and implementing tailored solutions that promote inclusion and resilience. By addressing the issue proactively, we can safeguard both individual and community well-being as a whole. Joining us today is Dr. Luis Torres-Hostos. Dr. Torres-Hostos is the founding dean and professor of the School of Social Work at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, Texas. Dr. Torres-Hostos, thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much, Andy. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to you and to Dr. Pat for this phenomenal project that is Reach. I have enjoyed all the different projects and podcasts and activities of the project, and I was delighted when Dr. Pat invited me to do one of the podcasts. So, like you said, I am the founding dean of the School of Social Work at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley here in Edinburgh, on the other side of the state where you are located over in El Paso. I've been here at the university for about 4 years, and we're building a School of Social Work where there had been a Department of Social Work for many, many years. Our community here is very similar to the El Paso community in many ways and slightly different in others. And that's why we've been collaborating with Dr. Pat on the Reach project.
Thank you so much. And so to start today's episode, can you tell us what factors you believe contribute to the radicalization of Hispanic youths?
Sure. It's important to start with a caveat that while there are many different factors that contribute to youth radicalization in general and to the radicalization of specific groups of youth, there is no one single factor that causes radicalization, right? There might be youth who are exposed to all of the things that we're going to talk about, and they don't become radicalized, right? They go through some traditional upheaval during adolescence, and they come out at the other end okay. And then for other youth, one factor might be sufficient. So it's really the intersection, the interplay of many different factors that can make youth susceptible to radicalization, to being recruited by radicalizing groups and heading in that direction. So, for youth in general, there's an important factor, which is the developmental stage that they find themselves in. Adolescence is a stage where there's this push and pull between wanting to belong to your family, to your community, to your ethnic or racial group, to society in general. But at the same time, this desire to be different, to strike out on your own, to do your own thing. There's also often the sense that people don't understand you, that people in your family don't get what you're about, that people are just trying to get you to be like them. And there's a natural instinct to rebel against that. And so, that's a typical of adolescence as a stage of differentiation, right? We're becoming different from our primary group, which is our family. And that could be a vulnerable time where youth could be seduced by a narrative like the one that some of these radicalizing groups use. Like, we do understand you. We get what you're about. With us, you can be who you want to be, right? So that's one of those factors. And, with specific groups like Latino, Hispanic, Latinx youth, there are other factors. There's for many of them who might be immigrant youth or first-generation immigrants, they're learning to become American, whatever that means in our different communities. They're learning about the broader society, about the broader culture, at the same time that they're still trying to hold on to some of their traditional cultural values prevalent in their various countries of origin, sometimes because they're curious about it and sometimes because their parents are pushing them to not forget where they come from, to stay connected to those roots. And so that could be a period of confusion, right? What group do I belong to? And then if you start throwing in layers, so there's racism and discrimination that sometimes creates anger and resentment and a desire to strike back. There are socioeconomic factors. Many Latino youth across the country live in communities that are poorer communities. They don't have as many resources. They may be going to underfunded schools. They may have fewer opportunities to advance themselves and their family in the labor market or through educational opportunities, right? And so it's a layered and complicated phenomena. You start to add all these things together and they might breed resentment against the majority group in society and make these youth vulnerable to groups that want to seduce them into a different narrative of radicalization, which is about striking back at those structures that are seen as responsible for the predicament that they may find themselves in.
Thank you for sharing. Do you know what are some common recruitment tactics used by extremist groups targeting Hispanic youths?
Oh, absolutely. The one that I was just talking about a moment ago, it is one that they use with all groups, right? We get you. We know what you're about, right? We're your real group. Nobody's going to understand you the way that we do, right? So, and that's seductive. It's seductive for anybody at any age. All of us go through periods of time in our lives, regardless of how old or how young we are, where we feel like, man, they don't get me. They don't get what I'm about. And hearing somebody or a group saying, I get you. I accept you the way that you are, can be very seductive for anybody, right? So that's one of them. Another one that they can use is to actually play on what we call traditional cultural values, that they're not unique to Hispanics or Latinos, but they're very prevalent in many Hispanic or Latino communities. One of them, for example, is the focus on family-centeredness. In the literature, you find it as referred to as familismo, right? And so these radicalized groups act like they're your family. We're your new family, right? And so that's something that's been ingrained in us since we're very young, that family comes first and loyalty to your family and doing whatever it takes for your family. And so if they succeed in replacing the adolescent's family of origin or the youth family of origin and being seen by the youth as their new family, that could be really, really dangerous, right? Because there's nothing that we wouldn't do for our family. That family-centeredness is one of the things that they prey on. And then the other one, there's this other strong cultural value that, again, it's not unique to Hispanics or Latinos, and it's seen in many traditional cultures, is this idea of respect for our elders, respect for our authority figures in our society. In the literature is referred to as respeto. And again, it's not unique to us, but it's very prevalent in Latino communities. And so these radicalized groups have their leaders, and their leaders are seen as elders, as people with a lot of authority. And it's really hard to stand up to them and to say no to them, right? So just like it's hard to stand up to mom or dad or grandpa or my uncle. And so they kind of replace the authority figures, the healthier authority figures in the life of the youth. And it could be really, really difficult to break from that. And so if you combine all of those things, like I was saying earlier, the adolescent stage that's about push and pull and who I am and belonging and differentiating, all at the same time. And you add the layers of social distress and social strife that I was talking about earlier, the lack of economic opportunities, lack of educational opportunities, living in marginalized communities. And then on top of that, you layer attempts by radicalizing groups to supplant the role of the family and the role of our elders and authority figures. You can see that it's a really, really dangerous mix, and that places our youth at very high risk for becoming radicalized.
Well, that's very interesting. Can you discuss any specific challenges or vulnerabilities faced by Hispanic youths that may make them susceptible to radicalization?
Yeah, absolutely. All the stuff that I was just talking about, right? So they're growing up in a community and a society that sometimes may be very accepting of who they are, and sometimes may completely reject who they are, right? That's true of the broader society. It's true of our families as well, right? I remember feeling very lucky when I was a kid and when I was an adolescent that I had friends that were from many different groups, right? And my mother modeled it. My mother had friends that were from very different groups and encouraged it as well, encouraged me and my sisters to be friends with everybody, to get to know people, no matter what they looked like, no matter what language they spoke, no matter what religion, they professed, how they chose to worship, no matter what political affiliation they had. But I also recall that there were classmates of mine whose lives were not like that, whose parents were always telling them to be very cautious, people that didn't look like them, that we stick to our own, right? They did everything in their family. They really didn't mix much with people from the outside. And so that kind of closed network, for lack of a better term, can make it difficult sometimes to be able to tell who has my best interest in mind and who is trying to attract me to something else, to a different end, for something else, to create terror, to create violence against my community, against my society. So I keep coming back to this point that it's layers. It's not any single thing. The other thing that I think it's important that we haven't touched on yet is that radicalization is a process. Right? It doesn't happen overnight. Nobody wakes up one day and says, hey, today I want to strike against my community. Today I want to join this radical group. Today I want to be a terrorist, for example, right? This happens over a long period of time where there are experiences that slowly make us more vulnerable to the narrative of these radicalized groups and more susceptible to their recruitment and seductive strategies.
Now we are going to switch gears and talk about the roles that families play. Can you share with us what role family dynamics and cultural identity play in shaping the radicalization pathways of Hispanic youths?
Absolutely. That's a great question. We've already touched on some of it, and I want to go back to them because some of the same things that I was talking about that can make youth more vulnerable to radicalization can also help us to keep them away from those dangerous narratives and to keep them more centered and more focused on pro-social and community-focused activities. So I was talking about the central role that family plays in many Latino communities and many traditional cultures which are family-centered. Latino communities, we know that regardless of acculturation stage or time in the country, whether they're recent immigrants or they're first-generation immigrants that have been here for a while, or they're second or third or fourth-generation immigrants, family continues to be really, really important, right? That's true of many cultures, mainstream culture included, but it has special salience in Latino communities. And so family is first. Family comes first. Family is the most important thing. The needs of the family sometimes outweigh my individual needs, right? So understanding the dynamics that come from that and allowing youth to also explore what it might be like to strike out on their own a little bit, to have a different path, to not have everything tied to family. can be healthy. That's that separation individuation phase or stage that all of us go through, all of us went through at some point in time. So trying to find your own voice and understanding that sometimes that voice can sing in unison with the voices of the family of origin that I come from and my broader culture, and that sometimes that voice could be a little bit dissonant, right? That it doesn't have to be the same, and that's okay, right? That's the key thing here. That it is okay to not be just like everybody else in my family. That's a dynamic that could be very, very healthy and useful if we are able to have those conversations with our youth. And it's a dynamic that can be very dangerous and push us in the direction of radicalizing groups if we feel that our family doesn't accept us because we're different, or that our community doesn't accept us because we're different. Because then what we're going to be looking is for that acceptance. We're going to be looking for a group that does accept us for who we are. And that's the narrative that these radicalizing groups play. We are your new family. We are your new group, right? We will accept you no matter what. It comes at a huge cost because sooner or later, they're going to start to ask you to do things that are going to hurt many of the people that you love. So that's one, right? That whole dynamic of family. And I had touched on it earlier. The other one that I touched on is the role of authority in our Hispanic communities and our families, right? So the patriarch of the family, the matriarch of the family, grandma and grandpa, the parents, those are people of authority. Our faith leader, the priest, the pastor, those are people of authority. And we are taught from an early age on to respect them. Their word is the law, right? They're an authority figure. And so when those folks in authority figures understand developmental stages and understand what youth are going through and can help youth navigate the challenges of adolescence and early adulthood and still feel that they are part of the family and part of the community, that's really healthy, and that is a great deterrent to radicalization. On the other hand, when they're the ones who are carrying the torch in terms of you're with us or you're against us, right? If you can't be like us, then you're not part of us. They can actually push youth and young adults in the direction of these radicalizing groups. So I think the important point that I'm trying to make here is that the same cultural values and cultural dynamics that can serve as protective factors against radicalization, if we're not aware of them and we don't know how to use them in a protective way, can actually push youth and young adults toward radicalization.
Thank you for your input. How does social media influence the radicalization process among Hispanic youths?
Oh my, that is a great question. The truth is that we tend to blame social media for all the ills that our society is facing today. And to be sure, social media bears some responsibility for it, right? One of the challenges with social media is the anonymity that it creates. And anonymity can push us in the direction of being extreme naturally, right? It can create conditions under which our worst instincts, our base instincts come to the surface. I'll give you a great example, right? Let's think about how many times we consider ourselves really mellow and laid back people, like people who wouldn't hurt a fly. But you're in your vehicle and you have your slightly tinted windows, you're in traffic and you're getting heated up and you get into these arguments with other drivers and you get violent and you're cutting people off and you're yelling out the window and you're giving them the finger and, what we call road rage, right? Which in part is fueled by a sense that they don't know who I am, right? I don't know who they are. And you just give in. You give in to the rage that you feel in the moment. And the rage may be natural. The conditions may be such that make you really, really angry. The response is not. And, if you knew, for example, that the person in that other vehicle that just cut you off was your pastor or your priest or your Uncle John, you probably wouldn't follow them and start cutting them off and yelling at them and giving them the finger, right? Or if you knew that it's your school principal and that she or he knows who you are, you would react in a different way. So that anonymity contributes to extreme reactions. And the same is true of social media. Most people on social media create some type of alternate identity, a handle, right? Your username is never your full name and last name, right? So the people that are consuming what you're putting out there may not know who you are. And that type of anonymity can breed extremism just on himself, extreme reactions. You know, we have trolls online whose job is just to harass people and get a rise out of it. And that type of behavior can be modeled by youth that wouldn't otherwise be that way. But they see other people doing it and they say, hey, this is okay. It's not just okay. It's fun to harass others, to rile them up. That's one of the things that Reach does so well. You know, the whole campaign on social media about kindness and being kind to others and being kind to ourselves is modeling a different way to respond, right? We may not be able to control every situation, but we can control how we respond to it. You know, we can choose to not respond in kind when somebody cuts us off aggressively, whether it's on the road or whether it's on the internet, you know, meaning, you know, we post something. It's happened to me. You know, I post something that I found interesting, and from my perspective, it's innocuous. And all of a sudden, somebody had a reaction to it and post this really nasty response, right? And so I can respond in kind and be nasty, and then that's just going to escalate. Or, you know, I can apologize to the person, say, I'm sorry that you took it the wrong way. That was not my intention, and leave it at that. And most people will be cool with it. But if it's somebody whose purpose is just to troll, the apology isn't going to be enough, and they're just going to keep going. And then I just ignore it, right? I ignore it, or I block that person, or whatever the case might be. I'm an older person, right? I've been around the block a few times. So I have those strategies and I know how to do those things. Our youth may not. So part of how we engage with our youth should be helping them learn how to use social media more responsibly, how to respond to people that are trying to get a rise out of you, how to not give in to our base instincts when we're provoked online, and how to resist the allure of anonymity. The fact that I can do whatever I want to online and nobody's going to know that it's me, that can be very alluring because we all have lots of ambivalent and conflicting feelings inside of us. And social media is like the Wild West. It's a place where, you know, I can put all that out there and it typically wouldn't be tied back to me, right? Of course, we all know that sooner or later it could be tied back to us. And that's a lesson in and of itself. I often tell my daughter, I have a young daughter and I have students. I'm a university professor. I'm always telling folks that, you know, be very mindful of what you post because once it's out there, right? You can't undo it. And we know that employers go online, prospective employers go online. Other people are trying to figure out who you are, what groups you belong to, what you've posted online, right? So we have a whole persona out there online that may not necessarily be our real persona, right? Or the persona that we have in our family and our society. And we have to work with youth to be more congruent between who we are in real life and who we are in an online environment. That's another strategy that can help us to deter radicalization.
Now, let's discuss the role acculturation plays. What role do you think acculturation plays in the radicalization process among Hispanic youths, particularly those living in immigrant communities?
Well, like all the factors that I've talked about, it can play a protective role and it can play a deficit-oriented role, right? A risk factor. It can be a protective factor or it can be a risk factor. So if you're an immigrant, particularly a first-generation immigrant, chances are that you're going to reside in a traditional immigrant enclave, in a place where there's a lot of people that look like you, and that's for a number of factors. It could be that, that's where your family who was already in the country lives. And naturally, that's where you go to. It could be that as a first-generation immigrant, you don't have a lot of financial resources, and those ethnic enclaves might be less expensive places to live in. So a first-generation immigrant is likely to live in what we call a barrio, an ethnic enclave. And so where everybody looks like you, everybody speaks like you, everybody eats like you, right? So you feel a sense of belonging. And that's really important, right? We have to remember that people may immigrate for many different reasons: economic factors, safety, escaping violence in countries of origin, looking for opportunities to improve your life and the lives of those that stay back home. So being in an environment that feels comfortable because it feels familiar could be very reassuring, and that could be a huge protective factor. And then slowly you start to learn the language, and you start to learn the customs and the culture of the mainstream society, and you start to reach out a little bit more. And a school is a great socialization tool, or acculturation tool, if you will, to the broader society. And that's where problems might start, right? If you live in a place that is accepting of people that are different and patient with you and understanding that it's going to take time to learn the language and the customs of the new host society, and also that it's okay for you to retain your language of origin and some of the customs of your culture of origin, that could be a very healthy process of acculturation, right? And that could lead to what we call biculturalism, bilingualism, where a person is proficient in both languages or more. A person is proficient in both cultures and understands them and is able to move back and forth effortlessly between them. There's a lot of literature that suggests that kind of a bicultural, bilingual identity for immigrants is a great protective factor, and it's associated with a lot of positive outcomes: health, mental health, economic, etc. And so that's kind of a success pathway, if you will. And if you're on a pathway like that, you're far less likely to be susceptible to radicalization, to being seduced by radical groups. But that's not always the case. Sometimes what you have is that when the person begins to interact with the broader society, if they even have the opportunity to do that, they find themselves rejected, ostracized. They find themselves that there are not many opportunities. They find themselves attacked. And we have seen an increase, a tremendous increase in anti-immigrant rhetoric, not just anti-immigration rhetoric, but anti-immigrant rhetoric, where people are told to go back to where they came from, where people are blamed for all the ills of society, from crime in our communities to labor shortages, right? So they're taking our jobs. And so all those kinds of things that you hear sometimes in the news, or you hear from some of our crazier uncles when we're sitting around the table at Thanksgiving. And that does something to folks, right? It kinds of pushes them away. It makes them feel that they're not wanted, that they're not appreciated, that there aren't opportunities for them to succeed here. And that can engender a lot of negative feelings towards the host society, and that in turn can make them susceptible to radicalizing voices, right? So those dynamics are very, very critical. And, they're different in different communities. And again, I keep coming back to the issue of layers, right? There are folks that live in marginalized communities that have some struggles with acculturation who don't become radicalized, right? Who continue to struggle, and eventually they come out at the other end successful. So I don't want to imply that any one of these things can make somebody radicalized. And that's an important message to keep repeating.
Next, what role do you think socioeconomic factors play in the radicalization of Hispanic youth?
Yeah, I mean, we've touched about that, right? So deprivation, lack of economic opportunities, lack of educational opportunities, an inability to move out of those ethnic enclaves into more mainstream communities that are going to be expensive, but that also are going to have better schools, right? Better funded schools and more opportunities to go to better universities if that's what you want to do, better colleges or to get a better job after high school, whatever the case might be. So it's all tied together, right? A lack of economic opportunities can make youth more susceptible to radicalization.
Equally important, how do issues such as discrimination, marginalization, and perceived injustice contribute to the radicalization of Hispanic youth?
It increases the risk, right? We've touched on many of these factors already, but those are the pieces, right? The many factors that I keep talking about. There's a combination of things that when they are brought together, they can increase risks of radicalization. And when we're aware of them and we manage them efficiently with the help of schools and families and society and programs like REACH, the outcome can be more positive.
Let's switch gears once again. What warning signs should parents, teachers, and community members be aware of to identify potential radicalization among Hispanic youths?
Yeah, that's a great question because we're talking about youth and there might be warning signs, or things that we might consider red flags that might just be an adolescent going through adolescence, right? Sometimes adolescents can become a little bit rebellious or they can become a little bit withdrawn. I've worked with families where the parents are distressed because all of a sudden the kid is talking back to them. And this was, typically a very respectful kid who would never talk back, right? And so, that could all be a natural adolescence development, right? All of those who have kids at some point wonder, what the hell happened to you? Somebody just switched you in the middle of the night, right? I have a 20-year-old daughter right now. So the important thing is to look at changes that seem to be much more drastic and much more longer term, right? So they start to hang out with what we would consider the wrong crowd. And the wrong crowd isn't necessarily kids that don't look like our family, right? But, a group that's getting into trouble or that's pushing a narrative that's an extremist narrative or a violent narrative. And so that's an important thing to look for. Mood changes, right? There are changes in our mood every single day, obviously. And adolescence is a time when youth can actually begin to experience some mental health issues, like some depression and some anxiety. And so we have to look for that as well. That might not, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are becoming radicalized, but we want to pay attention to those things and, if necessary, seek help. And then, of course, what we always want to look for is antisocial behavior, right? And so either talking or acting in a way that is about causing harm to others, and particularly, railing against the system or against society. And those are things that we really want to listen out for. And again, it's not one single thing. We're looking for patterns of behavior that are a consistent change from baseline, from the way that the person normally behaves, and that can indicate to us that they're going down a potentially dangerous path.
To conclude today's podcast, can you share with us what strategies you believe are effective in empowering Hispanic youths to resist extremist influences and ideologies?
Well, open communication is critical, right? So one of the things that these podcasts are meant to do is to bring this conversation out into the open, right? To openly talk about what radicalization is and what strategies the groups that are seeking to radicalize youth are using, and what are factors that might make our young people and our young adults, more susceptible to radicalization. So open communication is one of them. The other one is going beyond simply this issue of the podcast. I mean, we could make some wonderful podcasts, but if we can't put them in the living rooms of families that we want to connect with, that could be problematic. So, one of the things that we could be doing is taking the message on the road. And I know Reach does that through community forums, and that's a really important thing, these community conversations. But, we could also engage our faith-based communities, right? And train our faith leaders to talk about these things from the pulpit. Whether you're at Sunday service or whether you're at Mass, to hear the priest or the pastor or the reverend talking about these kinds of issues and giving the families in their community the tools to have these conversations with young people. Sometimes part of the challenge is the parents may not know how to have the conversation. So we have to equip our families with tools. The same thing with schools. Sometimes the teachers may not know how to have this conversation. So we always use that expression, it's way overused, it takes a village. But in this case, it's absolutely true. It takes a village. All of us working together to raise awareness of radicalization and what it is and how it happens, and to raise awareness of the ways in which we can protect youth from becoming radicalized.
Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today on this episode.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, and thank you for the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.